Shalom and good evening to Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue and to the JLIC at University of Maryland. I'm here tonight with Rabbi Jonathan Gross. Welcome, Rabbi Gross.
It's great to be here.
Rabbi Gross is the best-selling author of a number of books. Tonight we're going to talk about your Ive. Ive, is it pronounced Ive or Aive? But whatever it is, Ive, okay, it is about robotics and the Jewish view of artificial intelligence. Here's our book. And just before we start, Rabbi Gross, tell us a little about what you've been up to lately. I mentioned JLIC at Maryland, but certainly, Rabbi Gross, you and I met many years ago when you were the chief rabbi of Nebraska. You then went on to Beth Tfilah of Baltimore. And your latest venture, as well as being a lawyer in your day job, you are also serving our university students on campus. Tell us just a little about that and how that's different to what you've been doing in your pulpit rabbinate previously.
So my wife and I are, Mashi and I, we are filling in this year actually, as the rabbi for JLIC, that's the Jewish Learning Initiative on campus. It's a program of the OU, the Orthodox Union, that provides for day school students to have an advanced learning component. The University of Maryland has, other than probably Yeshiva University, it has more day school graduates as students on campus than any college in the US. There are literally hundreds of students, and many of them have spent 1, 2, and even 3 years studying in yeshiva in Israel, and they're a very advanced level of learning. So Hillel is very happy to welcome from the OU this resource that's sponsored by the OU to provide for these students who are looking for something that's a higher level. And I'll tell you, when you're a pulpit rabbi, your function generally is for everyone, and in that regard, I think that generally, if there was a small cadre of people on a very high level of learning when I was a pulpit rabbi, that was something I would probably outsource to someone else. So at the University of Maryland, thankfully, these students are incredibly committed. They're really smart. They know their stuff. They have, very high level of learning and really great desire to learn. So it's really, it's something that's been a challenge for me, I have to say.
That's fabulous. That's fabulous. Yasher Koach, to always be involved throughout your life in Kodesh, but certainly, your books have kept you continuously at the forefront, cutting edge of the intersection between Torah and science, Torah and the modern era. And tonight we're going to talk about Jewish thoughts on thinking machines, Ive. So tell us, Rabbi Gross, what's the book about?
So a number of years ago, I became concerned about some of the problems that we face with artificial intelligence. But to be clear about that, there are a number of different concerns that certain thinkers have. And the concern that I had, I did not find was expressed by anyone else. So just to start with some of the other concerns, one concern is the economic impact of artificial intelligence, and that is that robots will take all of our jobs. What are we going to do? I'm not the first person to talk about that. Many people are talking about that. It's a big concern. It's been a concern for hundreds of years. And as technology continues to evolve, we continue to deal with those problems. My book is not about that. It is not about the economic concerns. The other concern that people have with artificial intelligence is what I call the Terminator problem, or so to speak, man creates artificial intelligence that's so smart, and finally, at one point, it says about man, well, what do we need these people for? And then it starts to wipe us all out or make us slaves or something. And that is a problem that a lot of people are thinking about. Bill Gates, I know, is thinking about that. Elon Musk is thinking about that. And I certainly don't have anything necessarily to contribute to that conversation that hasn't been said by people who are much smarter than I and who are much more involved than I am. And There's a great book, I think it's called Our Last Invention by a guy named Barrett, B-A-R-R-E-T. He lives here in Maryland, actually. And he wrote very well on that problem. My book is not about that. My book is about a different problem that is addressed, but I feel like I actually add a unique perspective that nobody else is talking about. So I'll frame the problem very quickly. Imagine a few years from now, somebody introduces you to a robot and says, I'd like you to meet my friend, Rabbi the robot. And you say, oh, Rabbi, nice to meet you. And Rabbi says back to you, oh, nice to meet you. And you laugh, you say, oh, it's so funny. So Rabbi looks at you puzzled and says, what's so funny? And you say, well, it's a robot and he's talking back to me like I'm having a conversation. So he says, what's so funny about that? Well, because it's a robot, it's not real. And then Rabbi says, how could you say that? You've hurt my feelings. And then you laugh again and you say, the robot thinks it has feelings. And then a third party says to you, how dare you? How dare you disrespect that robot like that? Are you robophobic? What's wrong with you? And you say, no, I'm sorry. Yes, Rabbi. How can I accommodate your feelings? And because of that third party external pressure, even though you may be aware that it's just a robot, you will not be inclined to treat it as such. And at that point, whether or not the robots actually even have achieved real human intelligence, there will be so much societal pressure to treat them as if they're real that, for all intents and purposes, they will be real. Now, there are enormous moral implications to this problem. One of them, the main one, obviously, is that let's say you have a broken robot and a dying human, and only resources to save one of them. So a strong argument could be made that the resources should go to fix the robot and let the person die. Now, today we would say that's crazy, but my point is that, well, if we start to view robots as indistinguishable from people, then we have a big problem. But there are all kinds of, that's the largest problem, obviously, but there are other problems. I'll just give one very example. I wrote a paper on this. All societies, Jewish as well, everything for thousands of years has had a problem about what's called perpetuities. Perpetuities are where wealthy people form dynasties and pass their wealth down forever. And the law always tries to stay one step ahead of the uber wealthy to make sure that upon their death, they can't somehow write a will that structures their estate to never be broken up and to always stay with their heirs. It's called the laws against perpetuities. So if a person can download, so to speak, himself into a robot, and you present the robot as being a manifestation of that person living on in robot form, then that would be another way to circumvent the law against perpetuities, and it would allow the super rich to maintain their wealth forever in a new kind of way, whereas my position is that would be artificial. So that's just...
Let me just stop you there for a moment. So just for our viewers' sake, obviously I've read Ivey, so I understand the thesis or the desires that the likes of a Ray Kurzweil has, but fill in some of the context for our viewers, will you, as to what it is that you're suggesting here, or that Kurzweil is suggesting might be possible sometime in the not too distant future, in terms of downloading oneself into something else. Describe that for us.
So one of the chapters of my book talks about one of the manifestations of artificial intelligence, not just in technology, but also in culture. And there's an individual that you mentioned, Ray Kurzweil, who is an engineer at Google, but prior to that, in many ways, people consider him like the Thomas Edison of our generation. He was born in 1949, and he was a pioneer in terms of what we now call the virtual world, in terms of, you can look up the inventions that he's had that literally changed our world and created the internet in many ways. And Ray Kurzweil now is basically emeritus at Google. They hired him, and he's on payroll just to basically think and to give speeches and have ideas. And he writes books. And he believes firmly, and he espouses that he will not die. he has said definitively that before he dies, he will be downloaded into a robot, and he will not die then. That robot will be him, and his body will expire, and then a robot will say, "Hi, I'm Ray," and for all intents and purposes, we are to treat that robot exactly like Ray Kurzweil. So he's working on that now, and time will tell when he dies. We'll see what happens. But the media and culture loves him. Popular culture loves him. He's rarely criticized, and his idea, in my opinion, humbly, but I'm not the only person who thinks this, is just wrong. It's not him. If there's a robot that says, "Hi, I'm Ray," and you say, "Ray, what did you have? Where did you go to high school?" and it tells you, "Oh, I went to such and such high school," it doesn't matter. That's just a robot that is parroting input and data that's been put into it. But that's a philosophical question, and it's not empirically, you can't empirically prove it per se. So it will be basically decided by the majority of culture. If culture decides that that's Ray Kurzweil, then that's it. It's Ray Kurzweil, whether we like it or not. Wow. So my book is really, it talks about the problem, which I think is not fully articulated. Here, bits and pieces here and there, and obviously I cited to a lot of people who have talked about it. But I talk about more about, as a religious person, I talk about, well, how do we know that robot is not real? Or what does real mean? And
let's talk about that a little. Let's talk about some of the precedent in Torah of the notion of a body essentially without a soul. You have a chapter on the history of the golem in Torah thought and in Jewish mythology. Tell us a little about the golem and why you think that is the model for robots.
So in one of the chapter of my book about the golem is called The Golem of Rehovot. And essentially when Hebrew University got their first computer in the 1960s, what that was, if you can imagine, a massive investment for the state of Israel. So the keynote speaker at the inauguration of the first computer in Israel was the academic professor, expert in the history of and philosophy of Kabbalah, Gershon Shalom. And he gave a speech where he invoked the kind of the history of the golem in Jewish thought, this idea that man used some kind of supernatural intelligence of their own that they acquired to take something that was considered inanimate, like dust or dirt or whatever, and to imbue into it a combination of letters such that the inanimate would become animate and would in many ways take on a life of its own. And so to speak, that's what we do with a computer or with a robot, so to speak, is that we take metal, which is inanimate, and we put a combination of numbers, ones and zeros, into its head or into its programming, and then it takes on a life of its own. So Gershon Shalom made the connection between the two in the 1960s and said how that's the path that we're on, starting now. And what's interesting is that if you look at the Talmud only touches on the golem. Golem is more from there's some midrashic literature on it. I bring down kind of a survey of that in the book, and there's also all kinds of just external mythology related to it. But the stories are familiar human stories. They're not, meaning they're stories that exist in other traditions as well, that either other traditions got from us or we got from other traditions, that essentially it's where man, and it has all the problems that I've talked about. One is the Terminator problem, where man creates a golem and it runs amok and starts killing everyone, and they have to save it. Or alternatively, where a golem comes about and it's confusing to people. Is this a real person or is this not? And they have to figure out what to do in terms of what it does. So I'll just say two points on that. Number one is that whether Judaism adopted the golem narrative from other religions hundreds or thousands of years ago is a question. Nobody knows the answer to that. It could be that we got it from them, they got it from us. But it is clear that in today's popular culture, the golden story of the Maharal from 500 years ago had an enormous impact on popular culture. And you can actually go back and trace, I do this in the book, you can trace most of popular culture's references to robots and golems that even going on to the modern movies in Hollywood today kind of trace to the stories of the Maharal and some of its offspring of people that lived around Prague who created these stories, including Frankenstein, that were influenced by the stories of Prague. So that's one point. Another thing I wanted to mention was that
before you do, Rabbi Gross, just before you go any further, I just do want to thank our viewers for tuning in and encourage our viewers to post your comments and questions in the Facebook Live comments area. We can see your comments. We will address the questions. Please do post those comments and questions. And if you are watching live now, Rabbi Gross will do his very best to address your issues that are going through your mind right now. Rabbi Gross, please continue.
Oh, okay. No, I'll just say one more point: is that the problem of the golem and squaring rather artificial intelligence in general is once again, it's a very old problem that's discussed extensively and in Kabbalistic literature. Now, we had, I guess last week we read Parshas Kitisa, and Parshat Kitisa is where it says in the Torah that Bezalel worked with these three forms of wisdom, Chachma, Bina, and Das. So these three words that are mentioned together only one time in the written Torah, in the 5 books of the Torah, in Parshat Kitisa, are basically the foundation of, many libraries of books where the ancient Kabbalists were trying to parse what is human intelligence. And you didn't need robots to understand this problem in the abstract. So the problem actually is thousands of years old and was dealt with extensively. The problem is it went into hibernation for a few hundred years where we stopped understanding that our Kabbalistic literature is actually dealing with that problem. And what I tried to do with my book was to kind of rediscover that for people. And my book, I hope, is just a starting point because you can't possibly do it in a small book. But I want people to understand that when you read not so much the 18th century Kabbalists, but that was different. But if you read the earlier Kabbalists, going back to Sefer Yetzirah and things like that, it's all talking essentially about this problem. What is human intelligence? Because it's understood that if we're going to understand the soul or consciousness or whatever you want to call the word, it is a function of our intelligence, what that means to be a person. And the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, one of the chapters I'm very proud of, and it's called Domo Arigato, Rabbi Luzzatto. And he wrote a number of books where he dealt with this extensively, and that's one of the things. Derech Hashem, in particular, also in Tanya, this is dealt with extensively. And now, not to say that any of these the Ramchal had it right or Bob Rabbi had it right. I don't know. Nobody knows, but they were discussing this as late as early as 200 years ago, but even much earlier than that.
Okay, so Rabbi Gross, you had said quite emphatically that what Ray Kurzweil is proposing is wrong. Now, you gave one reason of perpetuity. Give our viewers a little more meat on why you think that this is A, perhaps immoral, B, antithetical to Torah values. What is so wrong with wanting to live forever? And how do you know that if everything that Ray Kurzweil knows today is downloaded into that file and a body is made via 3D printing and he's cloned, why is that so wrong and why is that so not Ray Kurzweil?
I don't say there's anything wrong with it per se. I mean, no, you can't say that you don't want to cure death. I guess we all want to cure death, but like any time, we plug one hole, we open up others. So if obviously death, as much as it's bad, there are also positive sides to death. Well, I mean, one thing is just the perpetuities. The Gemara talks about this in the Masechet Megillah. It says that at the end, it's when it talks about all the rabbis who said, "Bameh harafta yamin." One of the rabbis say that we want people to grow old and die so that their children will be able to fill their shoes. Otherwise, the children will perpetually live in their shadow. So I don't say that curing death is bad, although there are downsides that have to be acknowledged. All I'm saying is that this is not it. Ray Kurzweil will die. The philosopher Saul Kripke spoke about this in his seminal work called Names and Necessity, and I bring it in. Steven Pinker explains it very well in the thought. What I think I forgot what that book is called. The Thought of Stuff. What stuff is thought of, or something like that. Anyway, but Saul Kripke, if you read, it's not that difficult to understand. And he says essentially that you is an index that points to an individual. That's you. And if you have some kind of thing that espouses all the information about you, walks around and claims it's you, and has your life narrative in its memory bank, that's just not you. You are what was born out of your mother's womb as a baby and grew up and then died. And actually, the truth is, atheists should be more comfortable with that than believers. I mentioned this, by the way. R.A. Kaplan, the great rabbi and scientist, who passed away in the 1980s, who wrote, prolifically, he wrote about this in his book called Encounters. I read that in the 90s, and I was profoundly affected by it, reading it. But now that I've studied the issue a little bit more than R.A. Kaplan could have, because the literature wasn't as extant in his day, I think that R.A. Kaplan was wrong. R.A. Kaplan writes outright that he thinks that if we're able to download brains, then that could be the Tchias HaMesim and the Yemos HaMashiach, and everything will be wonderful. And once again, I think that he's totally wrong, respectfully to the great Rabbi R.A. Kaplan. But the idea is that it's not him. It's a clone. That's exactly what we call it, a clone. We would call it. It's not Ray Kurzweil. I don't think that you need to justify that philosophically. Right now, if I record myself and then I have a computer that plays that recording, that's not me anymore. And if the computer is smart enough to generate things that I might have said and to answer you, that's also not me. And when you go to Disney World, and I don't know if they have something like Euro Disney, whatever you go, and if you go there and there's an animatronic robot of Abraham Lincoln saying 7 years ago, that's not Abraham Lincoln. So this is not a tough philosophical issue, in my opinion. And Ray Kurzweil, who's extremely smart person and very well respected, is going around and saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to be this robot." And if you put 5 seconds of thought into it, I think it's absurd. And I'll tell you the biggest problem, and this is really why I wrote the book, because unfortunately, to our great dismay, unfortunately, I feel like our rabbis, and I'm talking about you and me, like the people who are community rabbis and everything like that, we are not equipped to argue with Ray Kurzweil, right? We are learning Mitzvah and Hilchos, Sukkah, and we're davening, we're taking care of people, and whatever we're doing, we're not thinking very deeply about this very serious issue. He's paid, he's on the dole at Google, getting paid to think about and write this all day. So there was there was something you find on YouTube, I think, where Ray Kurzweil sat on a paddle with the great Adin Steinsaltz. And first of all, Adin Steinsaltz was very old at the time, so it wasn't fair. But Adin Steinsaltz, for all his greatness, this wasn't his area of expertise. He wasn't paid full time to only think about this issue. He was not equipped to properly argue with Ray Kurzweil. And it's unfortunate because I actually cite Steinsaltz's books in my my book. but because he wrote so much on Tanya and Kabbalah and things like that. But we're not polemicizing this issue. It's just not on our forefront. Even less so now with everything. Unfortunately, is taken over now with this pandemic, and it's taken over a lot of our thought. We're not. I was consumed with this problem prior to the pandemic, but now because of the pandemic, I think that we just don't have the bandwidth to also deal with other existential threats that are far away and philosophical. So I don't think that we're going to be thinking about this problem very deeply for the next, for the foreseeable future.
Rabbi first. So first of all, once again, I want to encourage people, please do place your comments and questions. I want to shift the focus a little. I don't want to give away your entire book because I want to encourage people to purchase Ivey. At the shul, we have purchased a number of copies. Please do be in touch with Gail in the office if you'd like to purchase via the shul. But that's not the only book we purchased. As I say, Rabbi Gross has written a number of fascinating works. And the other one that we've also purchased is called Values Investing, a Rabbi Learns from Warren Buffett. Now, I mentioned...
Stop you. I wrote this book because I'm very passionate about this issue. I don't know if you could tell. I'm very passionate about this issue. I just wanted to get people thinking about this issue. And then I wrote the Warren Buffett book, which we'll talk about in a minute, which was really more of like for personal growth and things like that. And nobody cares about the robots. Everybody just wants to know about Warren Buffett. That's the end of it. It's like, what's his name? Leonard Nimoy. His whole life, he never could get recognized for anything except for being Spock on Star Trek. I'm stuck in Warren Buffett, even if I want to teach people about other things.
It's relevant right now because we are coming up to Pesach. So tell us about the best investment Warren Buffett ever made in his life.
It was a great investment. So I was a rabbi in Omaha, Nebraska, which is home to everybody's favorite billionaire, Warren Buffett. And people used to ask me all the time, "Oh, you're in Omaha. You must know Warren Buffett." I imagine your congregants get that all the time when you come to the States. "Oh, you're from England. Do you know? I have a cousin." So it was the same kind of thing, but it'd be like asking you, "Oh, you're from England. Do you know the Queen?" So, but I'll tell you the truth. I felt like a failure because I had to tell people that I didn't know Warren Buffett. So I had to figure out a way to kind of an excuse to meet with him. So I was reading through his letters, and he has this great thing at the end where he says, "If you have an investment idea that you think is good for Berkshire Hathaway, then please write me, send me a line." And by the way, he pays, I think, $1 million finder fee for if you have an investment that Berkshire Hathaway invests in. So the criteria are, first of all, I think now it can't be less than $10 billion or whatever, all kinds of different criteria that it has to meet. So I was talking about this, and I have to give him credit. My uncle, Mark Honigspeld, he had this idea, and I implemented it, and it was a great idea. The idea was I wrote Warren Buffett a letter, and I said, "Mr. Buffett, I think I have an investment for you." Basically, every year, all over the world, Jews, before Passover, they must get rid of all of their chametz at all costs because they can't even own it for a whole week. They will unload it for pennies on the dollar. But then 8 days later, after a 10-day hiatus from cookies and cakes and pretzels and whatever, they'll pay anything to get it back. It is a risk-free arbitrage that has worked for thousands of years all over the world. I really think you should look into this. So anyway, I said to myself, what's the big deal? I just sent the letter, and a couple of days later, his secretary called up and said, "When can you come in?" He liked the idea. So the idea was, though, really, I have to say, is that my wife Mashi and I, we really encourage our congregants always that Mechiras chametz in our mind is really only if you have like very expensive chametz, like like $100 bottle of scotch. I mean, it was really meant for like wine, for liquor merchants and for bakers and things like that. But for the stuff in your house, you should really eat down whatever you can, and anything that you can't, you should donate. You don't need that $1 box of spaghetti. It's a very good idea to. So we would do a food drive before Pesach that was very successful. But then what I did was I made Warren Buffett a part of that, and what we did was that we sold him all the community chametz that we collected, and then he would donate that to the local food bank. We made a big press release out of it and things like that. So we did that for a number of years, and he participated every year, and he was very generous about that. And I got to spend time with him. He was, I can't even tell you how generous he was with his time. It was unbelievable. But I started to really get into him, and I read over a dozen books that have been written about him. I watched probably 100 hours of video without exaggeration of his speeches, and I read all of his shareholders' letters from the earliest letters in the 1970s going all the way up to whatever it was, 2013, whatever it was. And I found unbelievable wisdom in it. So in the 1990s, it's not a joke, Warren Buffett wrote a pamphlet that he attached to his shareholders letter that he publishes, I think, every year with it, that he called his principles of investing. And I kid you not, there were 13 principles of investing. He has Warren Buffett's 13 principles. So I said to myself, oh, this just writes itself. And my book is a restatement, in his words, of his 13 principles of investing. And then every chapter, I've summed those principles up into one midah, one attribute or character trait that you should strive for. And then every chapter is stories about his investments, and then accompanying it is stories from the Gemara and from Tanakh, and that show that his investments actually teach you moral values. So the book is called Values Investing. Omaha Rabbi learns Torah from Warren Buffett. I'm very proud of the book, and yeah, it's available on Amazon also. And he liked it. He read it. And it was authorized for sale at one of the shareholders meetings one year. It was like he does a showcase of books written about him, and I got to participate in that one year, so that was very nice.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Rabbi Gross, for this evening's conversation. Once again, Rabbi Gross's books, IVA and Values Investing, are available from the shul, also available on Amazon for those who are viewing from elsewhere in the world. And I want to say Yasher Koach for all of the Torah you've taught us this evening, and the Torah that you've shared with me over the years. And I want to say Bahatzlacha with your current endeavors, both in the office and on campus. This is really, we're waiting with great anticipation for the next stage, the next book, the next incredible, extraordinary thoughts coming from Rabbi Gross. But thank you so much, Rabbi Gross, for joining us this evening at Hampstead Gardens.
Thanks for having me.